Hello and welcome back to part 2, and in this particular video we are going to be looking at the use of media queries. So if you recall, this is now our responsive site where we've made it flexible by adding EMs instead of pixels, and we have added percentages instead of pixels for our widths in both actual width and margin and padding. And so if we scroll in, it's fairly good until it hits a certain point. There we go. Now this image is starting to look a little ridiculous. Our columns are starting to look a little narrow, and our menu has now gone into a second row. And this is just going to keep getting worse as we go. This is where media queries step in, and that's what this video is going to be about. So let's go back over, back into our file. We're going to continue working with our style.css, and we've already gone through and created all this, and we've got nice comments as far as what we're doing and how we're achieving our widths and our pixel dimensions. I'm scrolling all the way to the bottom, and we are going to add our first media query. To do that, it's @media. You'll see in Dreamweaver, at least, this is going to change color on us. And I'm going to say only screen. And we're going to give it a max width, meaning that everything that's within this particular media query must be a maximum width of 1024 pixels. Generally speaking, this is the size of a tablet, particularly a tablet that's in landscape. As I mentioned in the video where I did talk about media queries, there are a lot of other parameters that we could include in with max width that do talk about, say, screen orientation, but I'm not going to do that for this. We're not going to be working on that with the lab. That's something that you're more than welcome to play around with on your own time. But right now we're going to look at max width. And so now I have my opening curly bracket and I'm going to close my curly bracket. This is my first media query that's going to be set up for tablet. So we need to think about some things that affect our screen as it gets smaller. So let's just go back and take a look as to when things start to get a little out of whack. Let's see, right about there. So some of the things that I've noticed that I want to change is the size of my H1 is a little going to be a little disproportionate, especially if I start getting smaller and smaller. So I'm going to change the size of my H1. Now remember, I do have an H1 up here at the top that is, I have a complex style that's H1, H2 that says what my font family is. That's fine. I'm going to leave that. And in this H1, it says that my color is white. That's fine too. I want to leave that, but I'm going to adjust this font size down a bit. So instead of considering it at 28 pixels, I've already worked this through and I'm going to go with 22 pixels, but everything else is going to stay the same. So we're going to do an H1. This part is just like a normal style sheet. So this media query is almost a style sheet within a style sheet. So I've created my H1. I'm going to go in and say I want my font size. I've already done the math. This is going to be 22 divided by 16. I will record this here so that you can see what it is. So it's 1.375 EMs. And we'll make that. And here's our comment so that we know what it is. So again, I reduced this by about equivalent of about 6 pixels. So it's 22 divided by 16 is where we came up with it. Remember, our fonts are divided by 16. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back out to my browser, and in its reduced size, I'm going to refresh it. And notice it got a little smaller. It's a little more in proportion here. One of the other things that I noticed is because of this starting to drop over is I'm thinking if I reduce the percentage between each of my menu items, that will probably help bring up menu 5 until I get into having to go down into the smartphone size. So let's go back here. Going to go work back in. Make sure you're in between the curly brackets of your media query. So I'm just going to go here and return. And we're going to do nav li. Open and close that. And this is where we're going to change that margin. Now I'm going to scroll back up again because we want to see what we've got. So nav li has a whole bunch of stuff. It says to align the text to the center, to make the width of it, to add certain padding. But it's this margin right here that I want to change. I'm still going to use 960 as my original screen size, but I've decided to reduce this to instead of what would be equivalent to 5 pixels down to 3. So let's go back down into our media query and just add the one thing that we want to change. So we're going to change our margin. We're leaving the 0 at the top. And again, I've done the math. So it's 0.3125%. And that is equal to 3 pixels divided by 960. And you might ask, well, why didn't you just do that from the beginning? Well, I didn't do that from the beginning because then there would have been too much gap on the right hand side of my page, and I didn't like that. So let's do our nav li. I'm going to save, and I'm going to go back into my browser, and I'm going to check what happens. So I'm going to refresh this. And notice how that brings that up nice. And now it's going to stay with us a little longer. So let's shrink this down. See, this works a lot better. Oh, there we go. And that's about our cell phone, smartphone size. So I'm just going to bring this back out a little bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. But one of the things that's also getting really weirdly disproportionate is this image is getting really small as far as its height goes. But it's keeping its proportion, which is why, as far as the width goes, and it's keeping the image proportion, which is why it keeps getting smaller as our screen size gets smaller. So what I want to do instead is I want to bring this image so it fills up this whole space and that the purple aside goes underneath it. So let's go change, this would be our section that contains our image, and the aside that contains the purple welcome box. So let's scroll down, and again staying within the media query brackets, let's adjust our section. Because before it was about 2/3. Now I want it to actually take up the entire width of our page. So I'm going to go with a width of 100%. And I want to have a margin bottom because if I don't do that, then the purple box is going to be butted up right next to it. So I'm going to do a margin bottom of 6 pixels. Then I also said we needed to adjust the purple box, which is what's contained in the aside. So we'll do aside, open and close that. And this is also going to take up 100% of our width, but we have some padding that we still need to take into account. So it needs to be just ever so slightly smaller than that. So I'm going to say, and again, trust me, I've done the math on this. It's 97.0, oops, not a space there, 08, and then a whole bunch of 3s. So I think there's 9 of them. So let's see, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and a 4. And that's our percentage. And what this is, how I achieved this, oops, let's get our semicolon in there, or it's really not going to work. How I achieved this is if you go back up to the aside here, I have a padding that is 1.45 5, 8, and a bunch of 3s. So what I did is I took 100% because I know I want the width to be 100%. So I'm working in percents here, but I'm going to comment it. It's 100%, so I'm going to include that there, minus 2 times. So I'm just going to put it in parentheses, and I'm going to go copy my number so I don't have to get it exact. So I'm going to copy that and bring it down here, paste that, my other parentheses, and then close out my comment. So what it is it's 100% of the width minus 1.45, a bunch of 3s for the padding on the left and right, which is why it's multiplied by 2. So that is my aside. And the other thing that I wanted to change is the minimum height. So if we scroll up, let's go find our aside. I had a minimum height here before of 265 pixels. And that was really just to keep it in tune with our image height. But as we got smaller, our image heights got smaller as well. So I'm going to click Save here. And we're going to just look at what we have before we determine what the image height should be. So let's go over to our browser. I'm going to click Refresh. And notice this is much better looking when we have this at the top. These go all the way across like they should. Our image goes all the way across. Our welcome goes all the way across. But look at how much extra space we have because we said the minimum height is 256. So let's change that. So I'm going to go in and return, and we're going to do min height. And I just arbitrarily took 72 pixels per inch. We know that it's probably bigger than that, but we want to make sure that it's not going to get too big again. So that's our minimum height. I'm going to save that. Let's go back to our browser and refresh. There, doesn't that look much, much better? So we've got this goes across, everything goes across. This is so much nicer. And now watch as we get bigger. It's going to go, there it is. Isn't that great? So let's go smaller again. And then we need to adjust some other pieces here. Okay, so just looking at what else we need to do, one of the other things that might happen as we get bigger is our columns might want to pop back up over onto the right hand here because we're using float lefts. So I just want to make absolutely sure that they decide to behave themselves. So I am going to use my class column left and create a style here. And I'm just going to do a clear both because I just want to make sure that it returns nicely on its own line. And the other thing that I noticed, let's go back, is when we get this smaller, again, we had a minimum height set up. Notice how funny these all look. So I'm going to give them a minimum height as well, just to clean this up a little bit. So let's go down here, and we're going to create a style grouping. So it's going to be column left, column center. Notice I'm separating these all with commas. And that's the last of the 3 columns. I'm going to close that. And what did I say I was going to do? Oh, I was going to give it a minimum height. So min, let's get this back up where it looks better. There we go. Min height. And I'm going to do a minimum height of 200 pixels just to kind of keep this looking neat. So let's do that, save it, refresh it, come back here, and see, at least it gets it a little more even. As we spread this out, there we go. Isn't that pretty? And I'm going to reduce the font size in both the columns, and I think that's it just because it's going to be a little bit smaller. And so as those columns get narrower, I still want it to be easy to read. So what I'm going to do is pretty much do the same thing I did up above, except it's going to be with the P for paragraph. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it, and do a space and a P before each of these. So I'm making a complex style in this case because I want the paragraphs only in my columns to be affected. And so we're gonna do a font size. And I've decided I'm only going to go down 1 pixel, so it would be 12. I did the math on this, so it's 0.75 EMs. I'm still going to leave my comments, so I know what I did. So it was 12 divided by 16 because it's a font. And now I'm going to save it and go back out to my browser and refresh it. And there it's just a little bit smaller. And so that as these columns get smaller, that they're still not going to be ridiculous. But now we're getting to this point, okay, now we're down to cell phone size. And yep, we've got this going. It's 100% across. That looks pretty good. But these 3 columns are just looking ridiculous. So we need to create another media query.